Picture a young African leader stepping into a den of global titans, defying their expectations with a bold vision that could redefine a continent's destiny. How did he turn skepticism into a historic partnership? Today's story takes place in the gleaming corridors of power in Riyadh, where billionaires decide the fate of nations over coffee, and where one man's refusal to bow changed everything. This isn't just about money or politics, it's about dignity, respect, and what happens when someone dares to rewrite the script everyone expects them to follow. By the end of this story, you'll understand why a single conversation in Saudi Arabia sent shockwaves across 3 continents and made a poor nation an equal partner overnight. The marble floors of the King Abdulaziz Conference Center reflected the morning light like mirrors, each surface polished to perfection. Outside, the Riyadh skyline stretched endlessly, glass towers reaching toward heaven, monuments to ambition and oil money. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation and the subtle tension that always accompanies gatherings of the world's most powerful people. It was March 15th, and the Saudi Crown Prince's annual investment summit was about to begin. This wasn't just any business meeting. This was where fortunes were made and lost with a handshake, where entire economies could shift with a single nod of approval. The guest list read like a directory of global influence. Tech billionaires from Silicon Valley, oil executives from Houston, manufacturing moguls from Germany, and heads of state whose signatures could move mountains. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman entered the Grand Hall at exactly 9 a.m., his presence commanding immediate attention. At 38, he had already transformed Saudi Arabia's economy, launched futuristic city projects worth hundreds of billions, and positioned his kingdom as a bridge between East and West. His Vision 2030 plan was reshaping not just Saudi Arabia, but the entire Middle East. Today, he would decide which global partnerships deserved his kingdom's vast resources. The delegates had been arriving since dawn. Private jets lined the tarmac at King Khalid International Airport like luxury cars in a showroom. Each visitor had come with proposals, presentations, and promises. They spoke of renewable energy projects, artificial intelligence ventures, space exploration initiatives, and smart city developments. The competition was fierce. Everyone wanted a piece of Saudi Arabia's $2 trillion public investment fund. Among the familiar faces were some surprises. The president of Singapore had flown in to discuss semiconductor manufacturing. Brazil's foreign minister brought proposals for agricultural technology exchanges. Even the prime minister of Estonia was there, pitching digital governance solutions. But buried deep in the day's agenda, almost as an afterthought, was a name that made many attendees scratch their heads in confusion. Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso. The whispers started immediately. Burkina Faso, the landlocked West African nation that most people couldn't locate on a map? What could possibly bring their leader to a summit designed for economic superpowers? The country's entire GDP was barely $15 billion, less than what some attendees spent on weekend acquisitions. Their infrastructure was decades behind, their resources limited, their international influence minimal. It seemed almost absurd. "Why is he even here?" murmured the German delegation. "What does Burkina Faso have that Saudi Arabia could possibly want?" The answer to that question would soon reshape everyone's understanding of power, partnership, and potential. As the morning sessions progressed, presentation after presentation followed the same predictable pattern. Sleek PowerPoint slides, impressive statistics, polished executives in $1,000 suits making carefully rehearsed pitches. The Crown Prince listened politely, asked strategic questions, and made non-committal promises to consider all proposals thoroughly. The atmosphere was professional, but cold. Business is business, nothing more. Then came the lunch break. Delegates mingled in small groups, discussing market trends and exchanging business cards. The Saudi officials moved through the crowd like gracious hosts, ensuring everyone felt welcomed, but maintaining the careful distance that power requires. It was during this intermission that Ibrahim Traoré finally made his appearance. He was nothing like what the room expected. At 35, he was younger than most CEOs present, but carried himself with a quiet confidence that was impossible to ignore. Unlike every other delegate, he wasn't wearing a Western business suit. Instead, he wore his nation's traditional military dress uniform, not as a costume or cultural display, but as a statement of identity and pride. The fabric wasn't expensive, the tailoring wasn't perfect, but something about his presence commanded respect. The conversations gradually quieted as people noticed him. Here was a man who clearly didn't belong in this world of billion-dollar deals and champagne networking, yet somehow seemed completely comfortable in his own skin. He didn't rush to introduce himself to influential figures or hand out business cards like confetti. He simply stood quietly, observing, waiting for his moment. When the afternoon sessions resumed, Traoré was scheduled to speak last. By that time of day, most delegates were already thinking about dinner plans and evening flights. The Crown Prince had sat through hours of presentations, his attention visibly waning despite his diplomatic politeness. Several attendees had already begun checking their phones and whispering about early departures. Then the moderator announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso." The polite applause was noticeably lukewarm. This was clearly viewed as the day's obligatory gesture toward African inclusion, a box to check rather than a serious business opportunity. Even the Crown Prince seemed to settle back in his chair with the resigned patience of someone enduring a necessary formality. Traoré walked to the podium with measured steps. He carried no laptop, no presentation remote, no stack of documents. No slideshow appeared on the massive screens flanking the stage. Instead, he simply stood there for a moment, making eye contact with different sections of the audience. The silence stretched just long enough to become noticeable, just long enough to make people lean forward slightly. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but carried clearly through the hall without amplification. "Your Royal Highness," he began. "Distinguished delegates, I have a question for you. When you close your eyes and imagine the future, what do you see?" The room stirred slightly. This wasn't the usual opening. No gratitude for the invitation, no praise for Saudi hospitality, no demographic statistics about Burkina Faso. "Do you see taller buildings, faster computers, more efficient machines?" Traoré continued. "Or do you see human beings standing a little straighter, walking a little prouder, dreaming a little bigger?" Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's eyebrows raised almost imperceptibly. This was definitely not a standard investment pitch. Traoré stepped away from the podium, moving closer to his audience. "For the past 6 hours, I've listened to brilliant minds. I've heard discussions about market penetration, profit margins, and return on investments. All important metrics, all necessary calculations. But I've heard very little about the one resource that actually creates wealth, human potential." He paused, letting that statement settle in. "Your Highness, your kingdom has invested brilliantly across the globe. Silicon Valley startups, European manufacturing, Asian technology hubs. You've built partnerships with nations that already have wealth, infrastructure, and stability. But may I ask, when did you last invest in raw human hunger?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Several delegates exchanged glances. This was beginning to feel less like a business presentation and more like a philosophical debate. "I come from a place most of you have never heard of," Traoré continued. "Burkina Faso, land of upright people. We have no oil reserves like our neighbors, no diamond mines like others, no vast coastlines for shipping. What we have is something far rarer in today's world, people who haven't yet learned that certain things are impossible." He reached into his jacket and withdrew something that made several people in the front row lean forward with curiosity. It was a small, weathered photograph. "This photograph picture was taken 3 months ago in a village called Gango," he said, holding it up. "The boy in this photograph is 10 years old. His name is Musa. Until recently, he had never seen electric light. His village had no power grid, no generators, nothing. When the sun set, their world went dark." Traoré's voice remained steady, but something in his tone had shifted. 3 months ago, we installed our first community solar photovoltaic panel in Gango. Not with foreign aid money, not with World Bank loans, but with resources we generated ourselves through agricultural export reforms and mining efficiency improvements. And do you know what happened when that first light bulb illuminated Musa's residence home?" The hall was completely silent. Even the Crown Prince had stopped fidgeting with his tablet. He didn't celebrate. He didn't dance. He looked at his father and said, "Now we can study after sunset. Now we can build something." 10 years old, and his first thought wasn't about entertainment or consumption or comfort. It was about productivity and creation construction. Traoré began walking slowly across the stage, slowly, his eyes moving from face to face. That photograph represents what I came here to discuss. Not charity, not aid, not development assistance, partnership. Real partnership between nations that have capital and nations that have hunger. He stopped directly in front of the Crown Prince's table. Your Highness, you've spoken eloquently about diversifying Saudi Arabia's economy beyond oil dependence. You've invested in artificial advancements, intelligence, renewable energy, tourism, and entertainment, all industry developments, all wise strategies. But may I suggest that your kingdom's greatest opportunity lies not in replacing oil revenues with technology, but in replacing oil revenues with transactions transformation. The boldness of this statement rippled through the room hall. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud this directly, especially not representatives from countries whose entire economies were smaller than Saudi Arabia's annual budget surplus. But Traoré was not finished yet. African continent is not a continent asking for handouts, he continued. We're a continent offering partnership. 54 nations, with over 1 billion people, most under the age of 25, the youngest, most energetic population on Earth, living on a continent landmass rich in minerals, arable land, and renewable energy potential. But here's what makes Africa different from other investment opportunities. We're still developing writing our story. He pulled out a tablet, the first piece of technology he had displayed, and projected a simple map onto the screens behind him. It showed the African continent with a series of dotted lines crisscrossing from West Africa to East Africa. This is the Trans-Sahel Infrastructure Corridor, he announced, a network of roads, railways, power lines, and highways, communication networks connecting Dakar to Djibouti. 8,000 kilometers coordinated of development across 12 nations. The largest infrastructure project in African history, designed not by African engineers, economists, and planners, not by foreign consultants, but by local professionals. The energy in the room had completely shifted. People were sitting up forward, phones were being set aside, and several delegates were taking notes. The total cost of this project is $800 million, Traoré continued. Much less than Saudi Arabia spends on a single luxury resort development, but the impact would be revolutionary. Imagine connecting West Africa's agricultural abundance with East Africa's trade routes. Ports. Imagine solar farms in the Sahara powering industrial centers from Senegal to Sudan. Imagine high-speed internet connecting African universities with global research networks. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was now leaning forward, his elbows resting on the table, his full attention completely focused entirely on the presentation. But here's why this matters to Saudi Arabia specifically, Traoré said, returning to address directly to the prince directly. This isn't just about African development, it's about positioning your kingdom as the bridge between continents. Every ton of cargo moving through this corridor could transit through Saudi ports. Every megawatt of solar energy could be supplemented by Saudi renewable technology. Every communication network could be enhanced by Saudi telecommunications investments. He clicked to the next slide, showing economic projections and trade flow estimates. Conservative estimates suggest this corridor would increase Saudi African trade by 400% within a decade. But more importantly, it would establish Saudi Arabia as not just a regional power, but as a global connector, the nation that links Africa with Asia, Europe, and the Americas. The presentation was becoming more technical now, with detailed financial projections models and implementation timelines, but Traoré kept returning to his central theme: partnership instead of patronage, investment instead of charity, transformation instead of transactions. Your Highness, he said, advancing to his final slide, every great kingdom in history is remembered not for what it accumulated, but for what it built. The Egyptians built pyramids, the Romans built roads, the British built roads, ships. What will Saudi Arabia build? He paused. I propose that Saudi Arabia build bridges, not physical bridges, but human bridges, economic bridges, bridges between the world's youngest continent and its most ambitious kingdom. The room was electrified, was electric with anticipation. This attention was no longer the polite endurance of a minor nation's pitch. It was a serious policy proposal with real strategic implications. But then, Traoré did something completely unexpected. He closed his tablet, stepped back from the microphone, and began speaking without any technological aid support at all. "However," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent hall, "I must be completely transparent honest with you. I didn't come here primarily to ask for your investment." A murmur of confusion rippled through the audience. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's demeanor sharpened with curiosity interest. "I came here to present you with a vision, something far more valuable than a business deal opportunity," Traoré continued. "I came to offer you a vision, a place in history, not as a kingdom that prospered, got rich from oil, but as a kingdom that empowered, helped other nations to prosper, get rich from their own resources. Not as a nation that purchased influence, but as a nation that earned influence through partnership and respect." He paused, letting this statement distinction to sink in. "The Trans-Saharan Sahel corridor will be built, with or without Saudi Arabia's participation. My country and our neighbors have already committed to making this a reality happen. We have Chinese partners interested, European investors inquiring, and American corporations studying feasibility. We don't need rescue. We need partnership." The boldness of this statement was breathtaking. Here was a representative from one of the world's poorest countries, essentially telling one of the world's wealthiest, richest countries that their participation was welcome, but not indispensable, essential. But Traoré wasn't finished, continued. "If Saudi Arabia chooses to join in this project, you won't just be investing in infrastructure, you'll be investing in the future of South-South cooperation. You'll be demonstrating that wealth is most powerful when it creates more wealth, not when it simply accumulates more wealth." He began walking toward the Crown Prince's table again, but this time his approach felt less like a presentation and more like a dialogue conversation between peers equals. "Your Highness, you've spoken about Vision 2030 and Saudi Arabia's transformation into a global hub. But imagine Vision 2050, Saudi Arabia as the nation that helped transform an entire continent. Imagine Saudi companies not just operating in Africa, but thriving, growing alongside with Africa. Imagine Saudi university students collaborating, studying in African universities. That Saudi investment helped develop, and African students researching in Saudi laboratories built with African resources." The vision he was painting was bold, expansive, ambitious, and entirely different from the conventional traditional donor-recipient model relationship that usually characterized North-South economic partnerships. "This is why I didn't prepare on a PowerPoint presentation asking for funds," Traoré said. "This is why I didn't bring a team delegation of advisors, consultants with financial forecasts, projections. This is why I came alone, speaking as one leader to another, offering a partnership of equals between equals." He stopped directly in front of the Crown Prince's table, close enough for a private conversation, but speaking loudly enough for the entire hall room to hear. "Your Highness, I believe that Saudi Arabia's greatest legacy achievement will not be the tallest skyscraper, building, or the fastest railway, train, or the most advanced artificial intelligence. Your greatest legacy achievement will be proving that true power lies not in creating dominating markets, but in fostering markets, developing not in monopolizing, controlling resources, but in nurturing resources, not in purchasing, buying loyalty, but in earning respect." The room was completely, utterly silent. This was either the most remarkable diplomatic presentation anyone had ever witnessed, or the most spectacular act of professional career suicide in modern geopolitical diplomacy history. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman remained motionless for several long seconds, his expression inscrutable, unreadable. The tension was palpable. Every delegate in the room understood they were witnessing a critical moment that could either launch a revolutionary partnership or end in diplomatic humiliation, embarrassment. Finally, the Crown Prince spoke. His voice was quiet, but his words carried clearly through the hushed hall. "President Traoré," he said, "in the past 5 years, I have heard thousands of investment proposals pitches. I have been presented with countless opportunities, proposals, and partnerships, most of them focused on what Saudi Arabia could offer, provide, our capital, our markets, our strategic position, our influence. He paused, his gaze fixed on Traoré's eyes locked on his. You are the first person to emphasize focus on what Saudi Arabia could aspire to become. The Crown Prince stood slowly, his movement causing a ripple of attention throughout the room. When he reached his full height, he continued speaking, but now he not spoke only to Traoré, but to the entire assembly. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have just witnessed, is precisely the kind of vision thinking that will define the next century of global development. President Traoré hasn't requested us to solve Africa's problems. He has invited us to participate in Africa's solutions. He began walking around his table, moving closer to the podium where Traoré stood. This is exactly the kind of partnership that Vision 2030 was designed to foster. Relationships based in mutual benefit, shared prosperity growth, and respect for each partner's contributions. The Crown Prince paused, stopped directly in front of Traoré, close enough for their exchange to feel personal, intimate, though everyone in the room strained to catch every word. Mr. President, he said, your Trans-Sahel Infrastructure Vision Corridor represents exactly the kind of transformative investment that Saudi Arabia wishes to support. Not because we view Africa as a charity recipient case, but because we see Africa as a collaborator partner in shaping the world's economic destiny future. He turned to address the broader audience. Saudi Arabia's public investment will allocate $500 million to the initial first phase of the Trans-Sahel Infrastructure Corridor, a corridor with additional commitments tied to project milestones and partner nation engagement. The announcement sent shockwaves through the room. Several delegates gasped audibly. This wasn't merely just a substantial financial pledge, it signaled a profound, fundamental shift in how Saudi Arabia engages with approached African partnerships. But the Crown Prince wasn't finished. Moreover, he continued, Saudi Arabia will establish a permanent African Partnership Office in Riyadh, dedicated specifically to identifying and advancing South-South cooperation opportunities. President Traoré, I would like to invite you to chair the advisory board for this new initiative. The offer was unprecedented. African leaders were typically invited to Saudi Arabia as petitioners, supplicants, or ceremonial participants, never as strategic architects partners in shaping Saudi policy. Traoré accepted with a simple nod, but his eyes conveyed the magnitude of what had just occurred. This wasn't just about funding money or infrastructure, it was about dignity, respect, and the realization that partnership could be more powerful than patronage. Your Highness, Traoré replied, this partnership will be remembered as the moment when the global South truly began cooperating rather than competing, when wealth became a tool for creating wealth rather than merely accumulating it. The Crown Prince smiled, the first genuine expression of satisfaction, pleasure he'd shown all day. Mr. President, I believe you're absolutely correct, right? And I believe this partnership will yield benefit both our nations far more than we can either currently imagine. The formal session concluded with polite applause, but the real energy was in the private conversations that followed. Delegates from other African nations immediately approached Traoré, eager to understand how their countries might participate in this new framework. European and American representatives began recalculating how this Saudi-African alliance partnership might impact their own continental relationships. But the most significant development occurred away from the cameras and microphones. As delegates began filing out of the conference hall, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman approached Traoré for a private exchange conversation. Mr. President, he said quietly, I want you to understand that your speech presentation today wasn't merely just impressive, it was necessary. Saudi Arabia has been seeking authentic partnerships rather than transactional relationships. You've demonstrated what that actually entails looks like. Traoré nodded appreciatively. Your Highness, Burkina Faso has learned that dignity surpasses charity is more valuable than charity, and partnership outweighs patronage. Today proved that these values principles can indeed actually work in practice, not merely just in theory. The Crown Prince extended his hand for a handshake, a gesture that felt less like diplomatic formality protocol and more like the beginning of a genuine partnership alliance. Mr. President, I believe this marks the beginning of something transformative for both our regions. As word news of the partnership spread beyond the conference walls, the reaction response was swift, immediate, and profound dramatic. African stock exchanges surged as investors recognized the potential implications of Saudi-backed infrastructure projects. Social media platforms erupted, exploded with discussions, commentary about this new model of global international cooperation. Young Africans shared clips of Traoré's keynote presentation with captions like, "This is what leadership embodies, looks like," and finally, a voice, someone speaking as an equal. International media coverage was widespread, but polarized, divided. Western outlets focused primarily on the geopolitical ramifications, analyzing how this Saudi-African partnership might affect their European and American leverage influence in the region on the continent. Chinese media highlighted the competitive aspects, noting that this could complicate their China's Belt and Road initiative in Africa. Middle Eastern publications hailed the partnership as a testament evidence of Saudi Arabia's ascending global leadership. But perhaps the most telling response came from other African leaders. Within 48 hours of the Riyadh Declaration announcement, presidents and prime ministers from across the continent reached out to both Saudi Arabia and Burkina Faso, eager to participate in this new paradigm framework for international cooperation. The president of Senegal called to discuss agricultural integration with connecting the Trans-Sahel corridor. The prime minister of Ethiopia inquired about linking the network to existing Chinese-funded infrastructure. Even South Africa's leadership began examining how their advanced economy could contribute to this continental initiative project. What made this response particularly striking was its sincerity, authenticity. These weren't routine diplomatic courtesies or perfunctory gestures of support. They were earnest, serious inquiries from leaders who recognized that something fundamental had shifted in how African nations could interact with global partners. Back in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's capital, the mood was euphoric, electric. Citizens gathered around radios and television screens to hear updates of their president's diplomatic victory triumph. For a nation accustomed to being overlooked or condescended to by global international partners, seeing their leader treated as an equal by one of the world's most powerful kingdoms was deeply, profoundly significant. But Traoré himself remained focused on execution rather than celebration. In interviews upon his return from Riyadh, he consistently emphasized the need for diligence to stay focused on implementation over results. A handshake in Saudi Arabia means nothing unless we deliver results in Africa, he told journalists, reporters firmly. Partnerships are validated through action performance, not promises. This practical mindset guided everything that followed. Instead of staging grandiose ceremonies or announcing unrealistic timelines, Traoré's administration government began the meticulous work of transforming diplomatic success into concrete developmental progress. The first step was launching the Trans-Sahel Coordination Office in Ouagadougou, staffed jointly by both Burkina Faso officials and Saudi technical experts. Their mandate was straightforward yet ambitious: turn the infrastructure corridor from vision to reality within 5 years. The Saudi pledge commitment proved more than symbolic. Within 3 months of the Riyadh summit, Saudi engineers were conducting site feasibility assessment studies across the Sahel region. Saudi construction firms were bidding on initial contracts, and Saudi financial institutions were forging correspondent banking ties with African institutions. But perhaps most crucially, what stood out was the partnership maintained its commitment to equity and mutual gain benefit. Rather than simply bankrolling African initiatives with Saudi funds, the collaboration emphasized genuine knowledge exchange and skill-building capacity building. African engineers collaborated alongside Saudi experts. African economists contributed to project designs, and African firms were given priority for construction contracts. This approach carried profound implications beyond the project itself. For decades, African development had been defined by dependency dynamics, reliance relationships with either former colonial powers, Cold War superpowers, or rising economies like China. The Saudi partnership introduced something distinctly different, a collaboration between developing nations grounded in complementary strengths rather than hierarchical imbalances. The ripple effect's impact reached far beyond mere economics. Young Africans began to view international relations differently, not as something imposed upon them, but as an arena they could actively shape it. Universities across the continent launched new programs in South-South cooperation and diplomatic strategies. African research institutes, think tanks began producing studies on alternative frameworks models for global international partnerships. 6 months after the Riyadh meeting, the first segment of the Trans-Sahel corridor broke ground in a ceremony that was intentionally modest, yet deeply symbolically resonant, powerful. Rather than inviting international dignitaries for a lavish event, the groundbreaking featured local community leaders, regional engineers, and the workers who would actually construct the infrastructure. Traoré's address speech at the event captured the moment's weight significance. Today, we don't just break ground for a highway road, we break ground for a new paradigm model of how nations can work together. We prove that partnership surpasses patronage, that dignity outweighs charity, and that the Global South can author its own narrative story of progress, development, and prosperity. The construction progressed efficiently, with Saudi technical expertise merging with African labor and resources to deliver results that surpassed initial projections. More importantly, the project created substantial job employment opportunities for local communities while fostering genuine technical expertise capacity that would endure beyond the specific infrastructure initiative development. As the first year of the partnership drew to a close, its success was indisputable, undeniable. The Trans-Sahel corridor was ahead of schedule and under budget. African-Saudi trade had increased by 60%. Most significantly, the partnership had inspired similar collaborations among other Global South nations. Brazil began exploring infrastructure alliances, partnerships with Nigeria, India deepened its engagement with East African tech sectors, and Mexico forged new trade ties with North African manufacturing hubs. The Saudi-African framework model was spreading, creating a web network of South-South partnerships that were reshaping global economic dynamics relationships. But the true gauge measure of the partnership's success wasn't in numbers, statistics, or trade volumes figures. It was in the fundamental transformation shift in how nations approached international cooperation. The conventional model of affluent, wealthy nations providing aid to poorer countries was being supplemented by a new paradigm of developing nations partnering with each other based on complementary strengths and mutual respect. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman reflected on this transformation during a speech commemorating the first anniversary of the Riyadh summit meeting. President Traoré taught us that true leadership isn't about possessing all the answers. It's about asking the right questions. He didn't ask us to solve Africa's problems. He invited us to participate in Africa's solutions. That invitation has transformed not only our relationship with Africa, but also our understanding of what partnership truly means. For his part, Traoré remained characteristically focused on results rather than accolades recognition. When asked about his diplomatic success, he consistently underscored the collaborative nature of the achievement. This partnership succeeded because it was based in truth rather than flattery, in mutual gain benefit rather than one-sided charity, and in respect rather than pity. Those principles can work anywhere, between any nations, if leaders have the courage to embrace them. The story of that day in Riyadh had become more than a diplomatic anecdote. It had become a blueprint model for how international relations could evolve in the 21st century. It proved that dignity and partnership weren't merely just moral ideals, but practical approaches, strategies that could yield superior results than traditional aid and dependency models relationships. As the Trans-Sahel corridor neared completion of its initial first phase, its impact was already visible. New enterprises, businesses were emerging along the route. Educational opportunities were expanding in connected communities, and, most importantly, young Africans were viewing their continent differently, not as a place needing rescue, but as one actively building its own destiny future. The partnership between Saudi Arabia and Burkina Faso had begun with one man's refusal to seek charity and his insistence on offering partnership instead. It had evolved, grown into a paradigm model that was inspiring similar collaborations across the global south and redefining how nations could work together in an interconnected world. And in Gango, that small village where the story began, 10-year-old Musa was now studying under electric light, dreaming of becoming an engineer, and growing up in a world where African leadership was reshaping global international relations. The boy in the photograph had become a symbol of what was possible when partnership supplanted patronage, when dignity triumphed over charity, and when leaders had the courage to demand respect rather than merely hoping for sympathy. The transformation was complete, but its impact was only just beginning. Ibrahim Traoré's speech at the Saudi Investment Summit left me inspired and reflective. At 35, the Burkina Faso president defied expectations, entering a room of global elites not to beg, but to offer a bold vision for the Trans-Sahel infrastructure corridor. His authenticity, eschewing slides for a photo of a boy named Musa, and his pride in his traditional uniform showed that true power lies in being unapologetically yourself. I felt a surge of admiration for his courage to demand partnership, not charity, from Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, proving dignity can reshape perceptions. Traoré's focus on human potential, like Musa's dream to study and build, struck a chord. It taught me to invest in people's growth, including my own, by learning new skills or mentoring others. His reframing of Burkina Faso's limitations as opportunities inspires me to see my challenges, lack of resources or experience, as chances to innovate. In my life, I'll seek partnerships based on mutual respect, whether in teamwork or friendships, and speak my truth boldly, even when it's daunting. Traoré's vision of building bridges motivates me to connect ideas and communities, fostering collaboration wherever I go. These lessons are practical. I'll embrace my identity, turn obstacles into possibilities, and uplift others to create lasting impact. Traoré's story shows that one voice can spark change, urging me to act with purpose daily. Traoré's speech is a call to lead with courage and dignity. If it moved you, like this video to spread the inspiration, share it with friends, subscribe for more transformative stories, and comment how you'll apply these lessons. Let's build bridges together. Start now.